The restaurant was a stage and Marcus was the director. The clinking of silverware, the controlled buzz of conversation, the sparkle of crystal glasses. It was all a symphony of success that he enjoyed. But a discordant note threatened the harmony. The sound came from his 7-year-old son, Thomas, sitting across from him. A low, constant hum, almost inaudible to others. But to Marcus, it was thunder. He saw the boy's legs swaying under the table, his eyes fixed on the hypnotic dance of ice, cubes in a glass. The overload was coming. Marcus felt the stares even if they were imaginary, and his jaw tightened. The evening, which was supposed to be a showcase of his status, was about to become a spectacle of his greatest failure. Marcus didn't see himself as an arrogant man. He saw himself as a successful man, and to him, the two were synonymous. He had built his empire from scratch, where every problem had a solution, every variable was controlled, every result was optimized. His life was a well-executed spreadsheet. Thomas was the cell he couldn't format. The autism diagnosis had been a direct blow to his ego. He remembered the neurologist's office, the words spectrum, communication challenges, hypersensitivity. His wife, Elena, cried silently beside him, but Marcus felt only icy fury. This was not a condition, it was a defect in his product, in his lineage. Since then, he had lived in a state of combative denial. He refused to use the word autistic. To him, Tom had difficulties, quirks, a phase that needed to be overcome with firmness and discipline. The love he felt for his son was distorted by a thick layer of shame. He loved the idea of Tom, the son who would succeed him, who would play football, who would bring a girlfriend to Sunday dinner. But the real boy, the boy who was fascinated for hours by the spinning washing machine and who was terrified of the sound of the blender, was a constant source of frustration. He felt like a failure. All his strategies, his powers of persuasion, his ability to impose his will on the world crumbled in the face of his son's silence. The arguments with Elena were brutal. "He needs acceptance, Marcus, not a drill sergeant," she pleaded. "Acceptance is a nice word for giving up," he retorted. He accused her of being too soft, of giving in to Tom's whims, without realizing that what she called giving in was actually accepting. He dragged Tom to social events, to expensive restaurants, like this one, believing in a kind of shock therapy. He believed that if he exposed his son to the real world often enough, eventually the boy would wake up and behave as expected. Each attempt resulted in a crisis, a public humiliation that only reinforced his conviction that he needed to be even tougher, more inflexible. It was a vicious cycle of pain, fueled by his wounded pride. Marcus's search for a solution for Tom was a relentless crusade, paved with false promises and misguided approaches. He wasn't looking for therapies that would help Tom navigate the world, but rather therapies that would force him to conform to Marcus's expectations. The first attempt was with a renowned behavioral psychologist, Dr. Alistair Finch, a man with a firm handshake and a spiel about extinguishing unwanted behaviors. Marcus loved the language. It was like exterminating a pest. For months, Tom was subjected to sessions where he was rewarded for maintaining forced eye contact and punished with indifference when he rocked or made his noises. The result was an even more anxious boy, who began biting his nails until they bled and having nightmares. Dr. Finch called this a extinction spike, a necessary phase. Marcus paid double, believing he was on the right track. The next hope came in the form of a social skills camp, an intensive summer program that promised to turn challenging children into leaders. He imagined Tom returning more confident and talkative. Instead, he received a phone call halfway through the program. Tom had had a severe meltdown after being forced to participate in a noisy game and had locked himself in his room, refusing to come out. Marcus went to get him. On the drive home, a heavy silence filled the car. Marcus didn't ask what had happened. He just said, his voice hard, "You've disappointed me, Thomas." Attempts at home were equally disastrous. He tried implementing a point system, where Tom earned privileges for acting normal. The system was too complex and completely ignored the boy's sensory needs. It ended with Tom crying in despair because he couldn't earn enough points to use his heavy blanket, his only comfort item. Elena, seeing the scene, tore the points chart off the wall. "That's enough, Marcus, this is cruel. This isn't hope, it's torture. For Marcus, cruelty was giving up. Hope was the mirage of a fixed sun that he pursued, regardless of the emotional cost to the child at the center of it all. The catastrophe in the restaurant came with the sound of breaking glass. A waiter, rushing by, dropped a tray of glasses not far from their table. The sharp, shattering sound was the trigger. For the others, it was a minor accident. For Thomas, it was an explosion, a sensory assault that knocked down the last of his defenses. Tom's low hum turned into a high-pitched whine. He curled up in his chair, his hands pressed so tightly over his ears that his fingertips turned white. His body began to rock back and forth, a pendulum of pure distress. Marcus's control shattered along with the glasses. Shame rose across his face like a feverish heat. He felt every gaze in the restaurant fixed on him. "Thomas, stop this," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. "Look at me. Stop this show now." He grabbed his son's arm, trying to force him to stop swaying. The action only made things worse. Tom's whimpering grew louder, attracting even more attention. Elena tried to intervene, her hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, let him go. You're hurting him." He shook her off like a fly. "Stay out of this, Elena. I know what I'm doing." "No, you don't," she retorted, tears welling up with anger and helplessness. "You never have." The argument, once confined to the walls of their home, was now public. Other customers were visibly uncomfortable. The manager approached with a concerned expression. For Marcus, this was rock bottom. His perfectly controlled world was imploding in a chorus of his son's cries and his wife's accusations. He was exposed not as a father dealing with a crisis, but as a tyrant losing his authority. Anger blinded him. He just wanted it to stop, for the ground to open up and swallow him along with his humiliation. It was in that moment of chaos that Clara appeared. She was one of the waitresses, a young woman Marcus had barely noticed, always moving silently and efficiently between the tables. He saw her approaching, and his first thought was irritation. Great, another person to give their 2 cents. But Clara didn't look at him. She didn't look at Elena or the manager, who was hesitating a few feet away. Her eyes were fixed only on Thomas. She moved with a calmness that seemed to distort the time around her. Without saying a single word, she knelt down beside Tom's chair, bringing herself to his level. Most people would have tried to talk, to touch, to calm him with words. Clara did the opposite. She entered his world. With deliberate slowness, she picked up 2 pieces of dessert cutlery, 2 heavy metal spoons from the table beside her. Then, on the wooden floor next to Tom's still swaying foot, she began to tap the spoons together. It wasn't a random sound. It was a rhythm. Slow, steady, predictable. Thump, thump, thump. A deep, resonant sound like a heart beating slowly. She didn't try to stop Tom. She didn't scold him or comfort him with empty phrases. She offered him a pattern, a sensory anchor in the midst of the chaotic storm of sounds and lights. Marcus stood frozen, watching the scene. It was the strangest thing he had ever seen. He expected her to try to solve the problem, but instead she was participating. She was creating a private order, a silent duet with her son's pain. It was a language he couldn't decipher, a form of communication that involved no logic, no orders, no bargaining. It was pure and simple. Empathy in action. Marcus, the man who always had all the answers, was speechless, completely disarmed by the borrower. Simplicity and depth of that gesture. The rhythm of the spoons continued. Thump, thump, thump. Slow and steady. And then, a small victory. Thomas's rocking began to slow down, synchronizing with the sound. His moans subsided, turning into silent sobs. Slowly, very slowly, he lowered one of his hands from his ears. His eyes, previously closed in agony, opened and focused, not on his father, but on the shiny spoons in Clara's hands. After perhaps a full minute, which seemed like an eternity, to Marcus, Tom reached out and, with his index finger, touched one of the spoons Clara was holding. It was a hesitant, curious touch. Clara stopped tapping. She looked at Tom's hand, then at his face, and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Then, with the same discretion with which she had arrived, she stood up, put the spoons back on the table, and walked away, resuming her work as if nothing had happened. The manager, seeing that calm had returned, backed off. The trip home was filled with a heavy silence, but it was different. It wasn't the silence of Marcus's anger, but the silence of his shock, of his defeat. For the first time, he didn't have a lecture ready, a criticism to make. He was empty of words. That night, he heard a sound coming from the kitchen. He went there and saw Tom sitting on the floor, banging 2 soup spoons on the tile, recreating the rhythm. Thump, thump. The old Marcus would have ripped the spoons from his hand, yelling about the noise and the scratched floor. The new Marcus, the broken Marcus of that night, just leaned against the doorframe and watched. And for the first time, he didn't see strange behavior that needed to be corrected. He saw his son regulating himself. He saw his son communicating. The next day, he approached Elena in the kitchen. The conversation that followed was the first in years in which he wasn't on the attack. "Elena," he began, his voice hoarse. "That waitress, what did she do?" The question was an olive branch. It was an acknowledgement that he didn't know everything. It was the beginning of a surrender. The image of Clara kneeling with the 2 spoons haunted Marcus. It haunted him in business meetings, during his morning runs, in the silence of his luxury car. That simple, silent gesture demolished the foundations on which he had built his identity. He had always believed that strength was control, that power was imposing his will. Clara used none of that. She used listening, not with her ears, but with her soul. She didn't try to drag Tom out of his crisis. She entered the crisis with him and gave him a tool to find his way back. He began to understand, with painful clarity, how arrogant he had been. He saw Tom's behavior as a personal affront, a rebellion against him, when in fact it was a desperate reaction to a world that was attacking him. All his solutions, the expensive therapists, the reward systems, the strict discipline, were about him. They were meant to calm his anxiety, to protect his ego, to mold Tom in his image. He realized that all his money, all his power and status were utterly useless. A waitress, probably earning minimum wage, with 2 dessert spoons, had more power to connect with and calm his son than he ever had with all his resources. The realization was deeply humiliating. But beneath the humiliation, something else began to grow. Respect. Respect for Clara. Respect for his wife Elena, whose approach he had always dismissed as weakness. He now saw that Elena's acceptance was not resignation. It was a much deeper and braver form of strength. It required letting go of one's ego, something he had never been able to do. The life he had built, based on control and appearances, suddenly seemed fragile and empty. He wasn't fixing his son, he was breaking his spirit. The waitress didn't fix Tom. She honored him, and in doing so, she broke Marcus, and in his ruins, he finally had the chance to rebuild himself as something different, as a father. 2 days later, Marcus returned to the restaurant, not during rush hour, but on a sleepy Tuesday afternoon. He felt like a nervous teenager. He asked to speak to Clara. She appeared, drying her hands on her apron, her expression neutral. "Sir?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcus struggled to find the words. His instinct was to pull out his wallet, offer a generous reward. That was how he settled things, but he knew that would be an insult. I wanted to thank you," he managed to say, "for what you did for my son." Clara looked at him for a moment, her eyes clear and direct. "I didn't do anything, sir. I just listened to what he needed. Sometimes silence is the only thing that calms the noise inside." The phrase hit him with the force of a revelation. Listening to what he needed. It was so simple, and yet he had never been able to do it. "How did you know?" he asked, genuinely curious. A small smile touched her lips. "The noise of the world is loud for me too. Rhythms help. Patterns help. I just offered him a pattern." She said too, and Marcus understood. She wasn't just being kind. She was sharing a secret from her own world. He just nodded, unable to say anything else. Months passed. Life didn't turn into a margarine commercial. Tom was still autistic. There were still difficult days, but the dynamic had completely changed. One Saturday, Marcus took Tom to a science museum. In a room full of gears and pendulums, Tom was mesmerized, clapping his hands softly, a smile on his face. The old Marcus would have scolded him, embarrassed him. The new Marcus knelt down beside him. "It's cool, isn't it, champ? Look at the pattern they make." He was no longer trying to silence his son's music. He was finally learning to listen to it. His relationship with Elena began to heal. rebuilt on a foundation of humility and shared effort. The road was long, but for the first time, it wasn't a battle. It was a journey. True strength isn't about controlling the world, but about having the courage to understand it. Each person carries an entire universe within them, with their own languages and rhythms. We just need to learn to listen. If this story made you think, like it, comment, and subscribe. Share it with someone who might need a new way of listening. The world can be a less noisy place if we really listen.